Imagine being born into a world of palaces and privileges, where your entire life is mapped out from the moment you take your first breath. You're not just any child, you're a prince, destined for a life of ceremonial duties, diplomatic functions, and the weight of centuries of tradition resting on your shoulders. For most, this gilded existence would be a dream come true. But what happens when the dream isn't yours? What happens when the call of boardrooms and business strategies feels more compelling than royal decrees and dynastic expectations? This is the extraordinary true story of a prince who walked away from a throne to chase something far more scandalous in the eyes of his family: a corporate career. In a world where bloodlines determine destinies, he chose to write his own. This isn't just a tale of rebellion, it's a collision of two entirely different universes, where the opulence of old world aristocracy meets the cutthroat ambition of modern business. It's a story about what happens when personal ambition challenges centuries of protocol, when a royal title becomes both a blessing and a burden, and when one man's desire for meaning overshadows the privilege of his birthright. We're about to dive into a narrative filled with shocking decisions, family turmoil, and a pursuit of identity that resonates with anyone who has ever wondered about the path not taken. You'll discover how a life of duty and deference gave way to one of deadlines and dividends, and why this prince's choice sent ripples through royal circles and corporate corridors alike. This journey is about more than one man's rebellion. It's about the universal struggle between who we are expected to be and who we truly wish to become. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and the price of freedom. From his earliest days, the world he knew was one of unparalleled privilege and profound responsibility. His nursery was a palace suite, his playground manicured gardens stretching for acres, and his companions often included children of other noble families, carefully selected for their status. This was a life meticulously crafted by centuries of tradition, a blueprint for royalty that left little room for deviation. Every aspect of his existence, from the clothes he wore to the way he spoke, was designed to reinforce his identity as a future leader, a living symbol of his nation's history and continuity. The weight of this destiny was not something he learned later in life. It was a constant, silent presence, woven into the very fabric of his daily routine. He was taught that his life was not his own. It belonged to the institution of the monarchy, to the people he would one day serve, and to the ancestors whose legacy he was bound to protect. This sense of duty was his first and most important lesson, a concept as fundamental as learning to walk or talk. His education was a rigorous undertaking, far removed from a typical school experience. Alongside standard academic subjects, his curriculum included intensive studies in constitutional law, national history, military strategy, and the intricate protocols of diplomatic engagement. He was trained in multiple languages not merely for fluency, but for the precise and formal discourse of statecraft. Every tutor, every advisor was chosen to sculpt him into the ideal figurehead, poised, knowledgeable, and unwavering in his commitment to his role. Even his leisure activities were laced with purpose. Equestrian skills were not just for sport, but for ceremonial parades. Learning to sail was about understanding naval tradition, and even seemingly casual public appearances were rehearsed to perfection. Each wave and smile a carefully executed part of a much larger performance. The concept of a private life was almost non-existent. His every success was a public celebration of the monarchy's strength, and any perceived failure was not a personal misstep, but a slight against the crown itself. The pressure to be flawless was immense, a constant burden carried by a young man who had never known any other way of being. The palace walls, for all their opulence, were as much a gilded cage as they were a home, defining the boundaries of a world where personal desire was always secondary to public duty. This was the only reality he had ever known, a path laid out with such certainty that imagining an alternative seemed not just rebellious, but utterly impossible. Yet for all its rigidity, this world was not entirely sealed off. The first cracks in his gilded reality appeared not through rebellion, but through sanctioned travel educational trips and diplomatic tours designed to show him the world he would one day help govern. These journeys, intended to reinforce his sense of duty, ironically became the very thing that challenged it. He walked through bustling financial districts not as a tourist, but as a royal observer, meeting captains of industry and innovators who were building empires of a very different kind. Where his world operated on tradition and inherited status, theirs thrived on disruption, merit, and measurable results. He sat in corporate boardrooms that hummed with a different kind of power, one that was earned, not bestowed. He listened to founders who started with nothing but an idea and built global enterprises through sheer force of will and intellect. The energy was palpable, a stark contrast to the quiet, predictable halls of his own home. These titans of industry weren't bound by centuries of protocol. They wrote their own rules, and their influence on the global stage was undeniable. He began to see a different model of leadership, one where impact was measured not by ceremonial appearances, but by innovation, job creation, and economic growth. A chance meeting with a particularly charismatic tech CEO perhaps served as a pivotal moment. Here was someone his own age, commanding respect not because of a title, but because of a vision. They spoke of global markets, strategic pivots, and the thrill of building something from the ground up. For a young man whose life path had been decided before he was born, this concept was utterly electrifying. It was the first time he truly considered that a person could create their own destiny rather than inherit it. Formal education abroad provided an even more profound sense of freedom. Attending a university under a carefully guarded pseudonym, he experienced a taste of anonymity he had never known. In lecture halls and campus cafes, he was just another student. He was graded on his own merits, debated ideas on equal footing with his peers, and formed friendships based on shared interests rather than royal obligation. This taste of a normal life was intoxicating. He could feel the weight of his title momentarily lift, and for the first time, he understood what it might be like to be valued for his mind and his character, rather than his lineage. These experiences planted a seed of profound curiosity. The disciplined, hierarchical world of business began to appeal to him not as a rejection of order, but as a different application of it. Corporate strategy required discipline, foresight, and leadership skills he had been trained for his entire life. Yet here, they could be applied to create something new, to leave a tangible mark on the world through enterprise rather than simply presiding over tradition. The ambition that had been carefully channeled toward statecraft began to yearn for a different outlet. He started to secretly devour business journals and economic reports, seeing in them a complex, global game far more engaging than the ceremonial duties that awaited him at home. Without even realizing it, he was already beginning his journey away from the throne, one inspired idea at a time. This fascination soon solidified into a tangible ambition, a clear vision of a life built on a foundation far different from the one he inherited. The allure wasn't merely about escaping tradition. It was about embracing a form of power that felt more authentic, more earned, and ultimately, more impactful. While his royal role offered immense influence, it was largely symbolic, a power to represent, to unify, and to advise, but not to execute or build directly. In the corporate world, he saw a different dynamic. Here, power was not a birthright, but a reward for vision, strategy, and results. The thrill lay in the creation itself, in taking an idea, assembling a team, navigating risk, and producing something tangible, whether it was a revolutionary product, a thriving company, or a new market. This was a hands-on form of leadership that appealed to his innate desire for agency and accomplishment. Financial independence also represented a profound form of personal freedom. Despite the vast wealth associated with the crown, his access to it was often circumscribed by tradition, family oversight, and public expectation. Every expenditure could be scrutinized, every investment viewed through the lens of royal propriety. Building his own fortune, however, would mean true autonomy. It would be capital that he alone had earned and controlled, a resource he could deploy based on his own judgment and values, without a committee of advisors questioning whether it was appropriate for a prince. This concept of self-made success was intoxicating. Furthermore, the metrics of success in business were refreshingly clear. A company's value, its market share, its growth. These were measurable outcomes. In his royal life, success was far more nebulous, often defined by favorable press coverage or public popularity, metrics that could be fickle and subjective. The corporate world offered a scoreboard, and he was drawn to the challenge of competing and winning on that field. He also began to see how corporate influence could achieve goals that ceremonial duties could not. A royal might champion a charitable cause, but a successful business leader could create thousands of jobs, invest in transformative technologies, and shape entire industries, driving progress on a massive scale. This was a practical, ground-level impact that resonated deeply with him. The very structure of corporate life, with its clear hierarchies based on competence rather than bloodline, felt strangely meritocratic and fair. He wouldn't be leading because of his title, but because of his ability to deliver. This wasn't a rejection of his upbringing, but rather a recalibration of it. He sought to apply the discipline, global perspective, and leadership skills honed in the palace to a new arena, one where the rewards were not hereditary privileges, but the profound satisfaction of building a legacy entirely his own. His decision to walk away sent a seismic shock through the very foundations of his family, a tremor that rattled generations of tradition. The initial reaction was not one of anger, but of utter disbelief, as if he had announced he intended to fly to the moon. To them, his chosen path was not just unconventional. It was incomprehensible, a direct rejection of everything they stood for, and a betrayal of the duty that had been their guiding principle for centuries. His parents, who had overseen every detail of his upbringing to prepare him for this singular destiny, were blindsided. His father, a man steeped in the weight of his own crown, likely saw it not as a personal choice, but as an abdication of a sacred responsibility to the nation. The arguments were fierce and layered with history. This wasn't a simple career change. It was a renunciation of identity. They argued that he was confusing a fleeting fascination with a lifelong calling, that he was throwing away his birthright for the vulgarity of commerce. The corporate world, in their view, was a realm of mercenary ambition, devoid of the honor and dignity inherent to their station. How could he trade the reverence of an entire nation for the possibility of a corner office and a stock portfolio? His mother's distress was perhaps more personal, rooted in fear for his place in the world and the social exile he might face. She would have pleaded with him to reconsider, framing it not as a command, but as a desperate wish to protect him from a life of struggle and potential ridicule among the very elite circles he was born into. Siblings, caught between loyalty to him and their own entrenched roles, might have reacted with a mix of confusion and resentment, worried about the added burden his departure would place on them and the unwanted media scrutiny it would bring upon the entire family. The wider aristocratic circle treated the news as the ultimate scandal. It was the talk of every drawing room and dinner party, a delicious piece of gossip wrapped in faux outrage. He became a cautionary tale, the prince who preferred spreadsheets to scepters. Whispers of ingratitude and madness circulated, with older relatives lamenting the modern world's corrupting influence on the youth. The tension within the palace walls became a constant, cold presence. Once friendly staff might have averted their eyes, unsure how to treat the heir who no longer wished to inherit. Every meal was a potential confrontation, every family gathering a minefield of unspoken disapproval and failed attempts to dissuade him. They presented him with every possible alternative: a modified role, a royal foundation to lead, a diplomatic post, anything that would keep him within the fold and maintain the family's carefully constructed image. But each compromise was just another version of the Gilded Cage, and he had already seen the world outside its bars. Their inability to understand his perspective only solidified his resolve, creating a chasm between his old life and the new one he was determined to build. The palace walls, designed to keep prying eyes out, proved utterly useless against the media storm that erupted the moment his decision became public. It wasn't just a news story. It was a full-blown cultural moment, a spectacle that every outlet, from the most respected broadsheets to the most outrageous tabloids, could feast upon for weeks. The coverage was relentless, a deluge of ink and pixels that dissected his choice from every conceivable angle, each publication framing the story to fit its own audience and agenda. For the serious, sober-minded political commentators, this was a constitutional crisis in the making. Their headlines were grave and measured, yet dripping with implication. Ere a parent steps back from destiny, one might read, while another pondered, a monarchy at a crossroads, modernity versus tradition. These pieces analyze the potential ramifications for the line of succession, the stability of the crown, and the very identity of the nation. Pundits debated whether this signaled a weakening of the institution itself, questioning if a monarchy could retain its mystique and authority when its central figures appeared to prefer the volatility of the stock market to the steadfastness of the throne. They interviewed historians who drew parallels to past abdications, though none were quite like this. Those were typically for love or war, never for a career in venture capital or private equity. The underlying tone in these analyses was one of profound confusion, an attempt to fit a thoroughly modern dilemma into an ancient framework, and a palpable anxiety about what his departure meant for the future. The tabloid press, however, held nothing back. They weren't interested in constitutional nuance. They were in the business of drama, and they had struck a gold mine. Their headlines were designed to scream from the grocery store checkout line, each one more sensational than the last. Royal rat, prince abandons family for fortune. One might blare alongside a grainy, unflattering photo. Another would speculate wildly with a headline like, "What's really behind his shock exit? A secret love child?" A massive debt. They painted him as everything from a spoiled, ungrateful brat, tossing aside his privilege, to a tragic, romantic figure breaking free from his gilded chains, depending on the week's narrative. They hounded his friends from university, offering cash for any shred of gossip about his double life. They sent photographers to camp outside the offices of any firm rumored to be considering him, hoping to capture the absurd image of a prince in a tailored suit, carrying a briefcase like a common commuter. The speculation about his motives knew no bounds. Was it a reckless midlife crisis? Was he secretly brilliant and finally proving it? Was there a scandal so deep the palace was covering it up, and this was his escape? They framed his choice not as a personal decision, but as a high society soap opera, reducing a complex internal struggle to a simple tale of rebellion and betrayal. The constant clickbait and paparazzi churn turned his deeply personal quest for meaning into a public commodity, something to be consumed and discarded with the next week's issue. Caught in the middle was the general public, whose reaction became a fascinating Rorschach test for how people viewed duty, privilege, and personal freedom. The media frenzy amplified every possible opinion, giving voice to both his staunchest critics and his most ardent defenders. Talk radio lines lit up with callers expressing outrage, calling him a disgrace who had spat on his birthright and failed his country. They saw his ambition as greed, his desire for autonomy as arrogance. How dare he refuse a duty others could only dream of? On the other side were those who cheered him as a hero of modern individualism. Online forums and social media, then in its earlier days, buzzed with support from young professionals who saw in his story a reflection of their own desires to break free from familial expectations and predefined career paths. They celebrated his courage to choose passion over position, to value self-determination over inherited status. Editorial cartoons captured the divide perfectly. One might show him trading a crown for a calculator, while another depicted him finally cutting the strings of a marionette controlled by his ancestors. The press didn't just report on this divide, it actively shaped it, presenting his story through whichever lens would generate the most engagement, controversy, and sales. In doing so, they created a permanent, sprawling public record of his decision, a cacophony of truth, half-truths, and outright fiction that would forever be a part of his legacy, proving that even a prince who walked away could not escape the relentless scrutiny of the modern world. This prince's journey, while unprecedented for a royal, echoes a fascinating and parallel narrative from a century earlier, though traveling in the exact opposite direction. During America's Gilded Age, a procession of extraordinarily wealthy heiresses sailed across the Atlantic, not to escape royalty, but to acquire it. Their mission was to trade New World fortunes for Old World titles, marrying into aristocratic European families whose prestige was intact, but whose coffers were often desperately empty. These women, like Consuelo Vanderbilt, who wed the Duke of Marlborough, or Jenny Jerome, who became Lady Randolph Churchill, were pioneers in navigating the treacherous waters between two powerful but vastly different cultures. They entered a world of stifling tradition and complex social codes, often viewed by the established aristocracy as little more than dollar princesses, glorified financiers for crumbling estates. Their value was calculated, their marriages transactions designed to restore gilded wallpaper to drafty palaces and keep ancestral lands within the family. They were expected to assimilate completely, to surrender their American spiritedness for the rigid conformity of their husband's world. Yet, in doing so, they became unexpected agents of change. They brought with them a certain modern energy, a different perspective on influence, and a vast fortune that, while initially seen as vulgar, ultimately granted them a unique form of power and independence their European counterparts rarely enjoyed. Our prince's story is the mirror image of this historical exchange. He isn't trading new money for an old title. He's trading an old title for the chance to make new money. He isn't crossing the Atlantic to buy into an aristocracy. He's crossing a conceptual ocean to leave one. But the core struggle is remarkably similar: the immense challenge of navigating two disparate worlds, each with its own unspoken rules and deeply ingrained prejudices. Those Gilded Age heiresses had to learn the delicate art of the curtsy and the precise order of precedence at a dinner party. Our prince had to master corporate jargon, equity structures, and the brutal honesty of a quarterly earnings report. Both journeys required a formidable act of translation, of taking the skills learned in one world and applying them to another. The heiresses used their wealth to wield soft power within the strict confines of their new roles, often becoming renowned hostesses and influential patrons behind the scenes. Similarly, the prince would learn to leverage the global perspective, diplomatic polish, and innate understanding of high-stakes pressure from his royal upbringing and apply it to the negotiating table and the boardroom. His name opened doors, yes, but it was his ability to navigate those rooms with a regal poise that set him apart from his competitors. The fundamental difference, and perhaps the more revolutionary one, lies in the direction of the ambition. For the dollar princesses, the ultimate goal was social elevation and the security of a title for their children. Their ambition was to cement their family's place within the existing old world hierarchy. Our prince's ambition was to step entirely outside that hierarchy and prove his worth in a system that supposedly valued merit above bloodline. He wasn't seeking to join a different elite. He was seeking to redefine what elite status could mean. His story isn't about blending old money with new, but about replacing inherited status with achieved success. In this sense, he wasn't following in the footsteps of those heiresses. He was walking the path they might have chosen if they'd had the freedom. He represents the logical, modern conclusion of their transactional journey, a world where the value of a person is not what they were born into, but what they built. Securing that first role was a delicate high-wire act performed without a net, a test of whether his ambition could survive its first contact with reality. It's unlikely he simply submitted a resume listing, Prince, under previous experience, and waited for a call. The path into the corporate world required a strategy as calculated as any royal tour, leveraging his unique assets while desperately trying to downplay the one thing that made him famous: his name. His education, conducted at elite institutions, provided the foundational credibility. A degree from a prestigious university, even if initially accessed through privilege, signaled a baseline of intellectual rigor that hiring managers could recognize. But that was merely the price of entry. The real key was his network, though it looked nothing like a typical graduate's. His Rolodex, cultivated over a lifetime of state functions and diplomatic receptions, contained names that were the stuff of business legend CEOs of multinational conglomerates, influential investors, and old money financiers who moved global markets. A casual introduction from a trusted contact could open doors that would remain forever closed to even the most brilliant MBA graduate. This presented his first major challenge, leveraging these connections without appearing to trade entirely on his title. He had to convince powerful people that he sought not a ceremonial role or a public relations coup for their firm, but a genuine, demanding position where he would be expected to deliver tangible results. The industry he chose would be the first true signal of his intent. Finance, with its clear metrics and culture that worships decisiveness, was a natural fit for someone with his background. Private equity or venture capital would allow him to operate at a strategic level, evaluating businesses and markets with a macro perspective similar to statecraft. Alternatively, he might have been drawn to the tech sector, an industry built on disrupting old hierarchies, a concept he was personally embodying. A role in a legacy conglomerate could also make sense, offering a structured corporate ladder that might feel familiar. Wherever he landed, the initial challenges were immense and deeply personal. The first was the unavoidable spectacle of his arrival. Colleagues didn't just see a new hire, they saw a walking, talking headline. Some would be sycophantic, hoping for reflected glory or a connection to his world. Others would be deeply skeptical, prejudging him as a spoiled dilettante who would flee at the first sign of a late night or a difficult client. Every minor mistake would be magnified, every success potentially attributed to his name rather than his skill. He had to work twice as hard to prove half as much. The most profound adjustment was the loss of inherent deference. In his previous life, his mere presence commanded a certain behavior. His opinion was sought because of who he was. In a conference room, he was now the most junior person, expected to speak only when spoken to and approve the value of every contribution. He had to learn the brutal language of corporate feedback, where a project isn't concerning but a complete failure, and where his ideas would be dissected and dismissed without a second thought for his feelings. The egalitarian nature of the office, where everyone from the intern to the managing director is on a first-name basis, was a culture shock. He was no longer Your Royal Highness. He was just another name on an org chart, fighting to be heard. This demanded a complete reinvention of his identity, not as a prince in a suit, but as a professional who had to earn his authority from the ground up. One successful project and one gained ounce of respect at a time. The transition from palace protocol to office politics was a daily masterclass in culture shock, filled with both comical missteps and profound personal adjustments. Imagine the sheer absurdity of a man accustomed to having his schedule managed by a team of private secretaries, now having to manually enter his vacation days into a clunky HR software portal. Or the prince, trained from childhood in the precise art of formal address, suddenly navigating a workplace where everyone, from the intern to the CEO, was on a strictly first-name basis. The most disorienting shift was the concept of time itself. Royal life operates on its own rhythm, a flow of engagements, ceremonies, and meetings that can start late and run long, dictated by tradition and circumstance. The corporate world, however, runs on the unyielding tyranny of the clock. 9 to 5 isn't a suggestion, it's a commandment. Being late for a meeting wasn't a minor faux pas. It was a sign of disrespect for everyone else's time. For someone whose previous arrivals were often an event in themselves, marked by fanfare and an adjusted schedule, the need to simply be at his desk by 9 a.m. sharp was a humbling new reality. The dress code presented another layer of silent negotiation. His wardrobe had been a uniform of power, tailored morning coats for day events, crisp white tie for state banquets, each item steeped in meaning and history. The corporate environment demanded a different kind of armor, the suit. But even here, there were unspoken rules he had to learn. His instinct might have been to reach for a bespoke, exquisitely tailored suit that screamed old-world money and privilege, a look that would have instantly marked him as an outsider in a room of off-the-rack department store blend. He had to learn to dress down his elegance, to blend in rather than stand out, understanding that in this new world, conformity could be a greater strategic advantage than distinction. The casual Friday ritual was perhaps the most baffling of all. The concept of deliberately choosing to be less formal was utterly foreign to a mindset where one was always inherently on display. Then there were the hierarchies, which were both similar and fundamentally different. He was used to a clear, unquestioned chain of command, but one based entirely on birthright and title. The corporate org chart was a maze of earned and assigned authority, where a 20-something project manager with a brilliant idea could hold more sway in a meeting than a senior vice president with an outdated approach. He had to learn to navigate this new power structure, where respect was demanded not by title, but by competence. Anecdotes from this period are both hilarious and revealing. There's the likely apocryphal but utterly plausible tale of him instinctively standing up straight and nodding slightly when his department head entered the room, a conditioned response to authority that left his colleagues bewildered. Or the time he might have referred to a business lunch as a private audience with a client, revealing the mental framework through which he was still processing interactions. More seriously, his diplomatic training, while an asset in negotiations, could also be a hindrance. He was conditioned to seek consensus and avoid direct confrontation, to speak in careful, nuanced language. In the blunt, profit-driven world of business, this could be mistaken for indecisiveness or a lack of conviction. He had to learn to be direct, to criticize a proposal openly in a meeting, and to make quick, firm decisions with limited information. A stark contrast to the deliberative, advice-heavy process of royal decision-making. Every day was a negotiation between two selves, the prince he was raised to be and the professional he was striving to become. His royal network became his most powerful, yet most delicate, corporate asset, a double-edged sword he had to learn to wield with immense precision. This wasn't the standard professional networking of exchanging business cards at a conference. It was an entirely different league of connection, built over generations and steeped in global influence. His address book contained the private contact information for world leaders, Fortune 500 CEOs, and the scions of old money dynasties, relationships forged in the rarefied air of state dinners and palace gardens. The challenge was not in accessing this world, but in repurposing its currency for his new life without crossing the ethical line into exploitation. He couldn't simply cold call a sovereign wealth fund manager. He could, however, leverage a pre-existing friendship to secure a discreet introductory lunch where the agenda was both personal and professional. These interactions were a masterclass in subtlety. An invitation to an exclusive charity gala or a private cultural event wasn't presented as a business opportunity, but as a social courtesy. Yet, in those opulent, off-the-record settings, surrounded by the most powerful people on the planet, the real work happened. Deals weren't signed on the spot, but seeds were planted. A casual conversation with a shipping magnate about art could seamlessly transition into the challenges of global logistics, allowing him to demonstrate his newfound expertise without ever pitching. He wasn't selling, he was engaging, and in doing so, he built a formidable reputation as someone who understood both the boardroom and the ballroom. This access granted him and his firm an almost unfair advantage in securing high-profile clients and partnerships. A tech startup founder might spend years trying to get a meeting with a particular European investment bank. The prince could get the bank's chairman on the phone in an afternoon, not because he demanded it, but because they had a standing rapport. For these elite clients, hiring his firm wasn't just a business decision, it was a status symbol. Having a former prince on your team, one who could open doors no amount of money could buy, lent an aura of unparalleled prestige and global reach. It signaled that your company operated at the highest echelons of power. He became the ultimate relationship manager, the secret weapon for landing accounts that competitors could only dream of. A negotiation that might have taken months of back and forth could be accelerated through a shared connection or a mutual understanding of the unspoken rules of high-stakes diplomacy. His presence at a pitch meeting wasn't just about his financial acumen. It was a non-verbal guarantee of discretion, trust, and access to a network that was otherwise hermetically sealed. But this immense power came with a constant, nagging ethical dilemma. Where was the line between leveraging a lifetime of built relationships and unfairly trading on a title he had ostensibly left behind? Critics would argue that every deal he secured through these channels was tainted, a form of aristocratic affirmative action that violated the meritocratic ideals of the business world he claimed to embrace? Was he winning business because his strategy was superior, or because his name opened the door wider? He had to walk a razor-thin line, ensuring that his royal background was the introduction, not the entire pitch. The substance had to be there. He had to deliver exceptional results to justify the privileged access, proving that his firm provided value far beyond his Rolodex. Furthermore, he risked commodifying his own family and relationships, turning personal bonds into transactional leverage. There was also the very real danger of blurring the lines between his nation's diplomatic interests and his corporate ambitions, potentially creating conflicts of interest that could embarrass the crown he had left. To navigate this, he likely adopted a strict personal code, only engaging with contacts where a genuine mutual interest existed, always leading with his business expertise rather than his title, and ensuring that any favor was reciprocal, not exploitative. He wasn't just building a company. He was meticulously constructing a new identity as a serious businessman who just happened to have a spectacularly unique background, constantly proving that his greatest asset wasn't his name, but what he could achieve with the opportunities it provided. Inevitably, the very advantages that accelerated his career became the source of his greatest professional scandal. The whispers that had always followed him, the suspicions that his success was built on privilege rather than merit, erupted into a full-blown public controversy with one particularly lucrative deal. The specifics would have been a perfect media storm. His firm, perhaps a boutique investment group or a venture capital fund he co-founded, secured an exclusive, highly sought-after contract with a sovereign wealth fund or a massive state-owned enterprise from a nation with close historical ties to his own monarchy. On the surface, it was a major coup, a testament to his firm's growing prowess. But the timing and the nature of the deal raised immediate red flags. Financial journalists and rival executives began connecting dots that painted a far less flattering picture. It was revealed that just weeks before the contract was announced, the prince had attended a private, off-the-record hunting weekend at a royal estate with the very foreign minister and economic advisor from that same nation. There was no agenda, no official minutes, just a social gathering of old acquaintances. Yet, the outcome was a multi-million-dollar agreement that bypassed several more established firms with deeper expertise. The headlines were brutal and relentless. Royal connections sealed the deal. One business daily asked pointedly. A more sensational tabloid screamed, "Prince of Privilege, how he cashes in on his family name." Industry blogs lit up with anonymous quotes from furious competitors, accusing him of aristocratic insider trading and turning diplomatic relationships into a personal profit center. The controversy wasn't that he was using his network. Everyone in business does that, but that his network was fundamentally unavailable to anyone else and existed entirely outside the normal rules of corporate engagement. How could anyone compete with a rival who could close a deal on a grouse moor that would take others months of formal pitches and competitive tenders? The accusation was a profound one, that he was not playing the same game as everyone else. He was accused of leveraging a form of soft power that was supposed to be used for statecraft, not for personal corporate gain, creating a glaring conflict of interest between his former life and his current one. Critics argued that foreign governments weren't hiring his firm for its financial genius, but as a way to curry favor with his family's monarchy, a modern-day tribute disguised as a business transaction. The impact on his reputation was immediate and severe. The carefully constructed image of the self-made businessman was severely tarnished. The narrative quickly shifted from Prince makes good on his own to Prince proves the system is rigged. Within the industry, the respect he had painstakingly earned began to fracture. Colleagues who had accepted him now looked at him with sideways glances, wondering if every one of his successes had similar hidden strings attached. The scandal forced a painful internal reckoning within his own firm. While the partners were undoubtedly thrilled with the massive fees, junior employees might have felt a sense of ethical unease, and other clients began to worry that their own business was being neglected in favor of these flashier, connection-driven deals. The most damaging aspect was the implied suggestion that he couldn't succeed without his title. It struck at the very heart of his reason for leaving, invalidating his entire journey of self-determination. He was forced to go on the defensive, perhaps giving a tense, carefully worded interview to a major financial publication, where he argued that all business is built on relationships, that his were simply different, and that the firm had won on the merits of its proposal. But the doubt had been sown. The scandal cemented a permanent dichotomy in his public perception. He was either a visionary who brilliantly leveraged his unique position, or a privileged man who had found a new way to benefit from an old system, depending on who you asked. It was a stain that would not easily wash out, a constant shadow that would be brought up whenever his name was mentioned in connection with a major new deal. The court of public opinion, however, proved far more nuanced and ultimately more forgiving than the tabloid firestorm or the whispers from his own social circle. His journey from prince to professional played out not just in boardrooms, but in the endlessly shifting arena of social media sentiment, newspaper editorials, and casual water cooler conversations, creating a fascinating case study in how we judge those who dare to reinvent themselves. Initially, the public mirrored the media's skepticism. For every person who admired his courage, another saw only staggering privilege and a profound lack of gratitude. Early polls conducted by lifestyle magazines and news outlets often showed a nation divided, largely along generational lines. Older citizens, who held the monarchy in deep reverence, tended to view his departure as a selfish abdication of a sacred duty. They saw a young man throwing away a birthright that others had fought and died to protect, trading national service for personal greed. Their comments on online articles were filled with words like shameful, disgrace, and let down. Yet, as months turned into years, a slow and significant shift began to take root. This change wasn't sparked by a single event, but by a gradual accumulation of evidence that he was, in fact, deadly serious about his new vocation. The first major turning point was often a lengthy, in-depth profile in a respected business publication, like The Economist or Forbes. Unlike the tabloids, these pieces focused less on the scandal and more on the substance. They detailed his work ethic, quoting anonymous colleagues who admitted their surprise at his preparedness and his willingness to put in the grueling hours. They analyzed his early deals, separating those won through obvious connections from those that demonstrated genuine market insight and strategic cunning. These articles reframed the conversation from who he was to what he was doing, and most importantly, how well he was doing it. He was no longer just a story about royalty. He was becoming a story about business. Social media became the primary battleground for this evolving narrative. On platforms like Twitter and LinkedIn, his every move was dissected by a global audience. When his firm announced a successful investment in a promising tech startup, the comments section would become a microcosm of the public debate. Skeptics would immediately pounce. Of course, they got funding. The founder probably went to school with his cousin. But these comments would now be quickly countered by others linking to the startup's impressive growth metrics, or pointing out that the prince's firm had invested at a much earlier, riskier stage than others had been willing to. Defenders emerged not just as royal fans, but as business enthusiasts who appreciated his apparent skill. A new archetype emerged in the comments, the young professional who saw in him a kindred spirit. They posted things like, "Say what you want about his start, but the man is delivering results. That's all that matters in the end." This faction began to wield a new and powerful word, earned. They argued he was earning his keep, earning his reputation, and earning the right to be judged on his current output, not his past life. This grudging respect crystallized into something more solid with his first major, undeniable success that was completely divorced from his royal ties. Perhaps it was leading a complex turnaround for a struggling mid-sized company, not in his usual network. A feat covered extensively in the business press. Or maybe it was a candid, no-nonsense interview on a popular financial podcast where he spoke with genuine authority about market trends, carefully avoiding any mention of his personal story unless directly asked, and even then, pivoting quickly back to business. In these moments, he wasn't trading on his title. He was demonstrating his expertise. People who had previously dismissed him were forced to reconsider. The public, often smarter and more fair-minded than they are given credit for, began to distinguish between the advantage of his background and the execution of his job. They could accept that his name opened doors, but they came to respect that he still had to walk through them and close the deal on his own merit. Polls conducted a few years into his second act began to reflect this maturation of public perception. The number of people who viewed him favorably as a businessman slowly but steadily climbed, while those who saw him as a dilettante steadily declined. He never achieved universal approval, of course. There would always be a segment of society that would never see him as anything other than a prince slumming it, and another that would always resent him for leaving his post. But the overarching narrative evolved from "can he do it?" to "he is doing it." The public's view became a curious blend of his two identities. He was the prince who became a competent professional. The monarchy lent a permanent aura of fascination to his story, but his work ethic and results built a layer of credibility atop it. He became a unique figure, a bridge between two worlds, ultimately respected not for leaving his old life behind, but for having the determination to succeed in his new one on its own terms. His first true boardroom battle was a baptism by fire, a high-stakes acquisition that pitted his fledgling commercial instincts against a room full of hardened veterans. The deal involved a family-owned manufacturing firm, a legacy business with a loyal customer base, but outdated operations. His firm saw an opportunity for a turnaround, but the founding family was deeply skeptical of outside investors, especially a group led by a man they saw as a pampered aristocrat playing businessman. The initial meeting was a disaster. The patriarch, a self-made man who had built the company from the ground up, openly challenged his credentials. What could you possibly know about meeting a payroll? He demanded, his tone dripping with contempt. The prince's first instinct, honed by a lifetime of avoiding public conflict, was to demur, to smooth things over with diplomatic platitudes. But he knew that in this arena, deference would be seen as weakness. He had to stand his ground. Instead of citing his title, he cited his homework. He calmly detailed his analysis of the company's supply chain inefficiencies, their missed opportunities in emerging markets, and the precise financial modeling his team had done on potential synergies. He spoke not as a prince, but as a prepared executive. He didn't win them over that day, but he earned their grudging attention. The real negotiation was a grueling, months-long process of incremental trust building. He had to prove his value wasn't in his name, but in his ideas. The successful close of that deal, on terms favorable to both sides, was his first major victory earned solely on the merits of his strategy, a crucial milestone that silenced many of his internal doubters. Another defining moment came during a tense shareholder showdown at a portfolio company teetering on the brink of collapse. The CEO, a charismatic but reckless founder, had driven the company into deep debt with an ill-advised expansion. As a major investor, the prince's firm had a seat on the board, and he was thrust into the center of the crisis. The boardroom became a war zone, divided between loyalists to the founder and factions demanding a complete leadership change. The prince found himself in the unfamiliar role of agitator, the one pushing for the founder's ouster. It was a brutal process, filled with late-night calls, legal threats, and personal accusations. His royal upbringing in navigating delicate power struggles proved unexpectedly useful. He understood the unspoken alliances and the art of building consensus behind the scenes. He worked the room not with demands, but with quiet, persuasive logic, meticulously outlining the financial realities that left no room for sentiment. When the final vote came to install a new CEO, his was the deciding voice. It was a somber victory, one that taught him the harsh weight of corporate decision-making, that saving a company and the jobs within it sometimes requires making profoundly unpopular and personal choices. This was a different kind of duty, one without any ceremonial silverware, where the stakes were measured in millions of dollars and hundreds of livelihoods. Perhaps his most public failure was a high-profile merger that fell apart at the 11th hour. His firm had spent nearly a year negotiating a complex union with a rival company, a deal that would have created a market leader. He had been a key architect of the strategy, and his involvement had initially dazzled the other side. However, during the final due diligence phase, significant cultural clashes emerged. The other company's leadership, a notoriously hard-nosed and informal group, grew frustrated with what they perceived as his team's overly cautious, process-oriented approach, a remnant of his methodical, protocol-driven background. The deal collapsed in a whirl of recriminations and leaked memos to the press, with the other side anonymously citing a failure to align on operational philosophy. The financial loss was significant, But the blow to his reputation was worse. Industry blogs declared it proof that he couldn't handle the cutthroat pace of real business. The experience was a humbling lesson that commercial acumen and a powerful network weren't enough. Success also required a deep understanding of corporate culture and the human element of deal making. He had focused on the numbers and the strategy, but had underestimated the personalities involved. This failure, though painful, was ultimately a critical education. It forced him to adapt, to become more agile and less rigid in his approach, proving that his greatest lessons weren't learned in palace briefing rooms, but in the aftermath of his own costly mistakes. The choice to trade a palace for an office didn't just redefine his career. It reconfigured his entire personal universe, placing every relationship under an unforgiving microscope. Within his established royal circles, the fallout was immediate and severe. Invitations to the most exclusive gatherings, once a given, simply stopped arriving. It wasn't a formal exile, but a quiet, unspoken social freezing out. Old friends from aristocratic families, whose loyalties were first and foremost to the institution of the monarchy, found themselves in an impossible position. Associating too closely with him could be seen as endorsing his rebellion, potentially jeopardizing their own family's standing with the crown. Conversations at the few events he did attend became strained, filled with awkward pauses and a palpable sense of disappointment. He was no longer one of them. He was a topic of conversation, a cautionary tale whispered behind raised hands. The loss was deeply personal, a severing of bonds forged since childhood, and it left a void that professional success could never truly fill. This social recalibration forced a Darwinian evolution of his friendships. The fair weather companions, those drawn to the glamour of his title rather than the substance of his character, fell away quickly. In their place, a new, smaller, and far more resilient inner circle began to form. It was composed of a few loyalists from his university days who had always seen the man behind the title, and surprisingly, a handful of figures from the periphery of his old life, lesser nobles or diplomatic staff, who themselves had felt like outsiders and admired his courage. More significantly, he began to forge genuine friendships within the business world. These were relationships built on a completely new foundation: shared professional struggles, mutual respect for competence, and a common language of markets and strategy. A bond formed with a fellow executive over the all-night stress of salvaging a deal was fundamentally different from one formed over a ceremonial gala. These new allies didn't curtsy or bow. They challenged him, debated him, and offered blunt advice, providing a refreshing authenticity his previous life had often lacked. Romantic relationships became a particularly complex minefield to navigate. Within his old world, any potential partner was immediately vetted for their suitability to one day become a consort, their family history scrutinized, and their every public mannerism coached. Now, dating was stripped of that dynastic weight, but laden with a new set of challenges. Was someone interested in him, or in the lingering fairy tale mystique of his past? The fear of being a trophy for a partner fascinated by royalty was a constant anxiety. Conversely, he might have encountered a defiant rejection of his background, with potential partners holding his privilege against him as an unchangeable mark of original sin. Finding a person who could see both facets of his identity, who could appreciate the unique perspective his upbringing afforded him without defining him by it, and who respected the professional he had worked to become, was a rare and difficult quest. Any relationship that did blossom had to be conducted under the harsh glare of the paparazzi, who were desperate to crown a new, commoner princess or dissect the breakup of a royal romance gone corporate. The most profound personal shift, however, was the redefinition of his relationship with his immediate family. The initial turmoil of his decision gradually settled into a fragile, often distant, new normal. Family gatherings, once a given, now required careful negotiation. His presence at major state events could be awkward, a living reminder of the path not taken. In his role, there was now that of a guest rather than a participant. The conversations with his parents evolved from heated arguments about duty to a more resigned, though perhaps still disappointed, acceptance. They learned to talk about his work, not as a betrayal, but as his job, asking questions about his projects with a hesitant curiosity. With siblings who remained within the system, there was often an unbridgeable gap in understanding. They could discuss family matters, but their daily realities were worlds apart, one dealing with diplomatic memos and public appearances, the other with quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. This distance wasn't always hostile. It was often simply sad, a constant low hum of divergence in what was once a shared destiny. He had traded the deep, suffocating entanglement of royal life for a newfound independence, but that freedom came with the quiet cost of no longer fully belonging to the world that had created him. The question of money was far more than a practical concern. It was the very bedrock of his newfound independence. To truly break free, he had to sever not just the symbolic ties of duty, but the financial umbilical cord that had sustained his gilded existence since birth. This meant confronting a complex web of royal trusts, state allowances, and family fortunes, all designed to support a life of service, not a life of self-directed ambition. The first and most profound step was almost certainly the voluntary relinquishment of his official appointee allowance, the public funds allocated to senior working royals to cover the costs of their official duties, staff, and household. By stepping down, he was ethically, and likely legally, obligated to stop drawing from this taxpayer-funded purse. This was a monumental shift. His income was no longer a guaranteed entitlement from the state. It was now something he had to generate himself, a terrifying and exhilarating prospect for a man who had never had to worry about a paycheck. His personal wealth, however, presented a more nuanced challenge. Most royals of his stature have assets held in complex, centuries-old trusts, managed by a committee of family advisors and lawyers. Gaining full, autonomous control over these resources would have been a Herculean task, likely requiring difficult negotiations and potentially triggering unfavorable tax consequences. The more pragmatic path, and the one he likely took, was to work within that system but establish clear, firewalled boundaries. He could have negotiated for his share of investment income or capital to be directed to a private, personal account, completely separate from the official royal finances. This account would then become the seed capital for his new life, not money he earned, but capital he now controlled and could choose to invest or spend according to his own judgment, free from the oversight of palace accountants questioning the propriety of a venture capital investment. The symbolic power of earning his first true paycheck cannot be overstated. For his entire life, money had been an abstract concept, something that simply appeared to maintain a certain standard of living. His first bonus or commission check, deposited into an account bearing only his name, represented something purer than any royal allowance, direct, quantifiable validation of his own skill and effort. It was proof that he could create value in the world that was entirely separate from his lineage. This financial self-sufficiency granted him a form of leverage he had never possessed within the monarchy. He could now fund his own lifestyle, make his own investments, and support his own choices without needing to seek approval from a family committee concerned with public perception. If he wanted to invest in a controversial tech startup or make a risky trade, the only person he had to answer to was himself and his business partners. This autonomy was the ultimate manifestation of his freedom. He wasn't just working a job. He was building an economic identity that was self-made, proving that his value wasn't inherited, but created. Juggling a calendar that contained both state funerals and shareholder meetings required a logistical prowess worthy of a military general. A constant high-wire act where a single misstep could cause a diplomatic incident or a multi-million-dollar deal to collapse. His life became a masterclass in compartmentalization, a relentless switching of gears between two universes operating on entirely different clocks and codes of conduct. One week might demand his presence at a solemn remembrance ceremony, requiring the somber demeanor and precise protocol of his royal training, only to be followed immediately by a cross-continental flight to lead a tense acquisition negotiation where the only thing that mattered was the bottom line. The mental whiplash was immense. In the morning, he could be in a palace drawing room, discussing the symbolism of a new national holiday with advisors. And by that same afternoon, he'd be on a video call dissecting quarterly earnings reports, forcing his brain to shift from centuries of tradition to the ruthless immediacy of the present fiscal year. The most palpable strain came from the immutable nature of the royal calendar. State occasions, trooping the color, diplomatic receptions for visiting heads of state. These were fixed points, set in stone, sometimes years in advance. The business world, by stark contrast, operates on a frantic, ever-shifting schedule dictated by market opportunities and client availability. A critical negotiation for a merger he had been working on for months could suddenly be scheduled for the exact same day as a major family wedding, a non-negotiable event where his absence would be seen as a profound and public snub. These collisions created impossible choices. Missing the royal event would fuel endless tabloid speculation about rifts within the family and his lack of commitment. Missing the business meeting could mean losing the confidence of his partners and clients, who expected his full attention and would not accept a prior royal engagement as a valid excuse. He was constantly forced to weigh his duty to his birth against his duty to his business, each choice carrying a heavy cost. To manage this, his team became essential translators and buffers between these two worlds. His executive assistant, a person more accustomed to corporate jet lag than palace protocol, had to learn the intricate language of the Lord Chamberlain's office, negotiating his presence at events with a deference that would not cause offense. Conversely, his private secretary from the royal household, whose job was once to manage his state diary, now had to understand that a board meeting in Tokyo could not simply be moved because it conflicted with a charity gala. This often led to behind-the-scenes turf wars, with each side believing their demands should take precedence. The solution was a brutally strict and color-coded master schedule, a document that treated a meeting with a foreign king and a presentation to venture capitalists with equal weight, each block of time fiercely guarded by its respective guardian. Even when he was physically present, his focus was often divided. There were undoubtedly occasions at a royal charity event where he would slip away to a quiet antechamber to take an urgent call from his office, still clad in his formal morning coat, speaking in hushed but intense tones about a crashing stock price or a hostile takeover bid. The cognitive dissonance of these moments was extreme one moment, embodying centuries of unchanging tradition. The next making split-second decisions that could alter the fortunes of a modern company. This balancing act also reshaped his approach to his remaining royal duties. He could no longer afford the leisurely, open-ended timelines of palace projects. When chairing one of his patronages, he likely brought a new corporate efficiency to the proceedings, pushing for clear agendas, measurable outcomes, and faster decision-making, sometimes to the chagrin of more traditionalist committee members who were used to a more deliberative pace. He was, in effect, trying to modernize the periphery of the monarchy, even as he was stepping away from its core, a testament to how deeply his new corporate mindset had already reshaped his approach to the world, forever blurring the lines between the prince he was and the professional he was determined to become. Navigating this uncharted territory would have been impossible without a handful of key figures in the business world who saw past the headlines and recognized his potential. These mentors didn't treat him as a novelty act or a public relations opportunity. They took a genuine interest in his development, offering the crucial guidance and protection he needed to find his footing. One such figure was likely a seasoned, semi-retired CEO of a global conglomerate, a man who had built his own empire from nothing and had little patience for inherited status. He would have been initially skeptical, perhaps even dismissive, of the young prince, but a shared passion for geopolitical strategy or a demonstrated work ethic during a chance meeting might have sparked his curiosity. This elder statesman of business would have become an invaluable sounding board, offering blunt, unvarnished advice that the prince's usual circle would never dare to deliver. He would have schooled him in the subtle art of corporate power dynamics, teaching him how to read a room of executives, when to push and when to retreat, and how to project authority without relying on the automatic deference his title once commanded. His mentorship was less about financial models and more about the human element of leadership, the gritty, practical wisdom that isn't taught in any MBA program. Another critical ally would have emerged from the finance sector, perhaps a managing director at a private equity firm known for its ruthless meritocracy. This person would have been drawn not to his title, but to his unique global perspective and his unnerving calm under pressure, traits honed in the diplomatic arena. Recognizing an analytical mind that could assess risk and opportunity from a truly macro viewpoint, this financier would have given him his first real break, offering him a junior role on a complex deal team. This mentor's role was one of a shield and an advocate. In internal meetings, he would have deflected the snide comments and skeptical glances from other partners, forcefully reiterating that the prince was there to work and would be judged on his contributions alone. He would have thrown him into the deep end with difficult analytical tasks, not to sabotage him, but to force him to prove his mettle to the entire office. This tough love approach provided the prince with something he desperately needed: a credential that was earned entirely within the walls of the firm, a success that his detractors could not attribute solely to his name. These relationships were symbiotic. The mentors gained a protege with a truly unique skill set, a person trained from birth in high-stakes negotiation, global etiquette, and the management of complex legacy institutions. They discovered that his value went beyond connections. He could walk into a negotiation with a foreign government or a family-owned conglomerate and understand the unspoken cultural cues and historical tensions that a typical MBA might completely miss. In return, they provided him with a safe harbor, a place to make mistakes away from the blinding glare of the public spotlight. They offered him the freedom to fail on a small scale, to learn from those errors, and to build his confidence away from the judgmental eyes of his family or the tabloids. These allies were his translators, helping him decode the informal language of business, the unwritten rules of office politics, and the complex social rituals of the corporate world. They were the architects of his professional reinvention, the ones who helped him dismantle the prince and methodically rebuild him as a professional, giving him the tools and the confidence to finally stand on his own 2 feet. The criticism came from every corner, a chorus of disapproval that grew louder with each new headline. Traditionalists within the aristocracy viewed his decision not as a career change, but as a profound act of betrayal against his class and his very bloodline. Their condemnation was often delivered not through public statements, but in the hushed, cutting tones of drawing room gossip. They spoke of his choice as a descent into vulgarity, a shocking embrace of the mercantile world that their ancestors had looked down upon for centuries. To them, a prince engaging in commerce was like a master painter taking up house decorating. It was a waste of a precious, divinely ordained resource. They argued he was squandering a legacy of service for the fleeting and shallow rewards of profit, trading a timeless duty for a temporal paycheck. Their greatest fear was that he was setting a dangerous precedent, that his rebellion would inspire others in his privileged position to follow suit, thereby eroding the very foundations of the aristocratic system that depended on unwavering adherence to tradition and role. From the world he was trying to enter, the skepticism was just as fierce, though it came from a completely different angle. Established business rivals and seasoned executives questioned his credentials with a brutal, bottom-line pragmatism. In their eyes, his entire professional identity was a contradiction. How could someone who had never had to interview for a job, never worried about a mortgage, and never faced the possibility of genuine financial failure possibly understand the cutthroat realities of the market? They saw his entry not as a meritocratic achievement, but as the ultimate exercise in privilege. A man using a royal title as a skeleton key to unlock doors that remained firmly bolted for even the most talented outsiders. The whispers in boardrooms and at industry conferences were relentless. They speculated that any success he found would be unearned, the direct result of his unparalleled network, rather than any inherent business acumen. Let's see how he does when the family name isn't on the letterhead. They'd mutter, dismissing his early wins as preordained. This cohort didn't question his right to exist in their world. They questioned his right to compete in it on a supposedly level playing field, convinced the game was rigged in his favor from the start. Public intellectuals and cultural commentators added a more philosophical layer to the opposition. In newspaper editorials and televised debates, they framed his choice as a symptom of a broader societal malaise, the triumph of crass materialism over higher ideals. They lamented that even a prince, a figure supposedly insulated from such base concerns, had succumbed to the siren song of commerce, choosing the accumulation of personal wealth over the stewardship of national heritage. One particularly scathing op-ed might have accused him of embodying the worst of both worlds, leveraging the unearned privilege of aristocracy to chase the unprincipled ambition of modern capitalism, creating a morally hollow hybrid. Another might have painted him as a tragic figure, a man so alienated from his own purpose that he sought meaning in spreadsheets, blind to the deeper fulfillment of service that was his birthright. These critiques hurt the most because they attacked not just his actions, but his very character, framing his ambition as a spiritual failing and a retreat from responsibility into selfishness. Even some members of the public, who might have been expected to cheer for the underdog, expressed a surprising level of disapproval. For many, the monarchy represents stability, tradition, and a living connection to history, a beautiful, if anachronistic, fairy tale. His departure was seen by these supporters as a rupture in that narrative, a selfish act that diminished the magic of the institution. They felt a sense of personal letdown, as if he had abandoned a role they themselves cherished and projected their ideals onto. Calls to radio talk shows featured older listeners expressing sadness that a young man would so casually discard a duty that soldiers had died to protect. Their criticism was less about anger and more about a profound sense of loss, the feeling that something special and rare had been carelessly broken, all for the chance to become just another wealthy businessman in a world already full of them. This multifaceted opposition created a constant low-grade hum of negativity that formed the backdrop of his new life, a relentless reminder that his every move would be judged by two entirely different sets of rules, and that satisfying one audience often meant alienating the other. The first major validation arrived not with a fanfare, but with a quiet internal memo announcing his promotion to vice president. This wasn't a ceremonial title bestowed by birthright. It was earned through 18 months of grueling work, characterized by late nights analyzing market trends and weekends spent mastering the intricacies of financial modeling. The promotion was a direct result of his leadership on a complex cross-border merger that had initially been met with deep skepticism from the older partners. His unique ability to navigate the cultural nuances of the deal, a skill honed in diplomatic circles, proved to be the decisive factor in bringing both parties to an agreement. This milestone was profoundly personal. It was a piece of data, a quantifiable metric that proved his value was being measured on a spreadsheet of performance, not a family tree of ancestry. For the first time, his professional advancement was completely detached from his lineage, a silent but powerful rebuttal to every critic who said he couldn't succeed on his own merits. His ultimate professional vindication, however, came with the spectacularly successful launch of his own private equity firm. This venture was his brainchild, conceived and built from the ground up with a handful of trusted colleagues who believed in his vision. Securing the initial capital was his first major hurdle, and he deliberately sought investors who were backing his strategy and his team's expertise, not his famous name. The firm's flagship fund focused on turning around distressed mid-market companies in overlooked industrial sectors, a deliberate choice to avoid the flashy, connection-driven deals he had been criticized for earlier. The strategy was high risk and required deep operational understanding, not just financial engineering. When that first fund delivered returns that dramatically outperformed the market average, the industry took notice. Financial publications that had once covered his social life now published in-depth analyses of his investment thesis, praising his contrarian approach and his firm's hands-on management style. This success was unassailable. It was measured in cold, hard percentages that appealed to the most pragmatic investors on the planet. The crowning achievement, the moment that forever silenced the whispers of him being a dilettante, was likely a prestigious industry award, perhaps being named Dealmaker of the Year by a major financial publication, or receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award from a global business council. The significance of such an honor wasn't in the black tie dinner or the glass trophy. It was in the voter roll. These awards are typically decided by a jury of his peers' hard-nosed CEOs, rival investors, and financial journalists renowned for their skepticism. Their recognition meant that the very establishment he had sought to join now accepted him not as a prince, but as a peer. In his acceptance speech, he likely spoke not of palaces or protocol, but of market cycles, operational efficiencies, and the talented team behind their success. He had successfully reframed his own narrative. He was no longer the prince who worked in business. He was a business leader who happened to have been born a prince. These milestones, each one hard-won, formed an irrefutable body of evidence that his corporate career was not a rebellious phase or a curious experiment, but a legitimate, impactful, and fully realized second act. Behind the polished facade of boardroom success and the relentless pace of his new life, a quiet and profound psychological struggle was unfolding. The constant code switching, the effort to fit into two worlds while feeling he truly belonged to neither, exacted a heavy emotional toll that no amount of professional validation could entirely erase. This was not the stress of long hours or difficult deals, which he could handle with trained composure. It was the deep, existential fatigue of perpetually performing, of never being able to fully let his guard down and simply be. In the rare moments of solitude, the mask would slip, revealing a man grappling with a crippling sense of isolation. He was too royal for the corporate world, and now too corporate for the royal world, existing in a lonely no man's land between identities. Old friends from his previous life didn't understand the pressures of his new one, and new colleagues could never truly comprehend the weight of the life he had left behind. This left him profoundly alone, stranded between two tribes, with no one who could fully understand the entirety of his experience. This isolation fermented into a relentless bout of imposter syndrome, a feeling that he was fraudulently occupying both of his lives. In the corporate sphere, every achievement was shadowed by a nagging doubt. Was that deal closed because of his sharp analysis, or because the other party was star-struck by his title? Was he respected for his competence, or merely tolerated for his connections? He was haunted by the fear that his entire second act was an elaborate charade, that he was simply playing the role of a businessman without the inherent right to be one. Conversely, on the rare occasions he returned to royal functions, a different kind of insecurity took hold. Surrounded by family and courtiers who had remained within the system, he felt like an imposter there, too. He was now an outsider looking in, a ghost at the feast who had abandoned his post. His tailored business suit felt like a costume among the mourning coats and medals, a visual reminder that he had broken the code and chosen a different path. He was no longer a fully committed member of that world, and his presence served only to highlight his absence, making him feel like a traitor in his own home. This internal conflict amounted to a severe identity crisis, a fundamental struggle to answer the question, who am I, really? For the first 3 decades of his life, that question had a ready-made answer, provided by centuries of tradition and the accident of his birth. He was His Royal Highness, a defined role with a clear script. By walking away, he had torn up that script and thrown himself into a world where identity is not given, but built, and the construction process was agonizing. He was deconstructing the prince and trying to assemble the professional, but the pieces didn't always fit. The disciplined, diplomatic, and reserved demeanor that was so valued in his royal upbringing could be misinterpreted as aloofness or a lack of passion in the more informal, aggressively expressive corporate culture. He had to consciously learn to be more direct, to show emotion, to high-five a colleague after a win behaviors that felt alien and performative. He was caught between the instinct to observe protocol and the need to project authentic passion, creating a constant internal friction. In later years, rare interviews and passages from authorized biographies would offer glimpses into this turmoil. He might have confessed to a trusted biographer that the loneliest moment wasn't at a deserted airport on a business trip, but sitting in a packed boardroom feeling utterly invisible, as if the person everyone was talking to was a fictional character he himself had invented. He might have described the surreal experience of reading about himself in the press, seeing his internal struggle reduced to a simplistic narrative of rebellion or greed, and feeling a profound disconnect between the public caricature and his complicated private reality. The emotional cost was a constant low-grade anxiety, a feeling of being perpetually off balance, never quite sure which version of himself he was supposed to be presenting in any given moment. The corporate prince had achieved his goal of freedom, but that freedom came with a daunting and often overwhelming responsibility, the burden of having to choose every single day who he was going to be. His unprecedented journey did not occur in a vacuum. It sent a tremor through the very foundations of contemporary royalty, offering a controversial yet compelling new blueprint for a generation of aristocrats grappling with their place in a rapidly modernizing world. For decades, the unwritten contract for minor royals and those not in the direct line of succession was a simple, if stifling, bargain. Accept a life of subsidized ceremonial duties in exchange for surrendering any serious professional ambition. They were expected to become patrons of charities, ribbon cutters at hospital wings, and dignified background figures at state banquets. A life of genteel purpose, but often one devoid of tangible achievement or personal agency. Our prince's very public and ultimately successful foray into the corporate arena shattered this model, demonstrating that it was possible to leverage the unique advantages of a royal upbringing without being wholly consumed by it. He proved that the skills honed in palaces diplomacy, understanding complex hierarchies, managing immense pressure, were not obsolete relics, but were in fact highly transferable and even valuable assets in the global business world. Suddenly, the well-trodden path of quiet duty seemed less like an honor and more like a choice, and for some, a poor one. This created a palpable ripple effect, particularly among the younger, more globally educated members of various royal houses across Europe. They watched his story unfold not as a scandal, but as a case study. They saw him navigate the initial ridicule, weather the professional storms, and eventually earn a grudging respect on his own terms. For a princess with an advanced degree in economics, or a duke with a passion for sustainable technology, his life became a powerful proof of concept. It sparked quiet, undoubtedly tense conversations behind palace walls, with younger royals gently pushing back against courtiers and older relatives, using his career as evidence that a life outside the institution could still bring prestige to the family name, albeit of a different kind. They began to argue that a royal who becomes a respected CEO or a pioneering tech investor could enhance the monarchy's relevance by connecting it to the engines of the modern economy, rather than allowing it to remain a beautiful but detached museum piece. His struggle provided them with a roadmap for the pitfalls to avoid, particularly the ethical minefield of blending state connections with private enterprise, and underscored the absolute necessity of delivering measurable results to silence critics. The most significant shift he inspired is perhaps the gradual normalization of hybrid royal careers. While a complete abdication of all duties remains rare and radical, many younger royals now actively seek to blend a reduced portfolio of traditional patronages with serious professional pursuits. We see princes launching venture capital funds focused on green energy, princesses leveraging their public platforms to build successful fashion or lifestyle brands, and others completing advanced degrees with the clear intent of practicing law or medicine. The key change is that these are no longer framed as charming hobbies or side projects, but as legitimate careers that command their time and focus. The public and the press, having lived through the initial shock of our prince's departure, have become somewhat more accepting of this model. While scrutiny remains intense, there is a growing acknowledgement that compelling a highly educated individual to spend their life-opening flower shows simply because of their birth order is an archaic waste of potential. His journey forced a long overdue conversation about the value of royal work versus real work, and in doing so, he expanded the realm of possibility for every royal who follows, granting them a sliver of the autonomy he fought so hard to win for himself. The media's portrayal of his journey was a narrative in itself, a slow-motion evolution from a circus sideshow to a serious business story. The initial frenzy, driven by a hunger for sensational drama, could not be sustained forever. A pivotal turning point arrived when a prestigious financial publication, perhaps the Financial Times or The Economist, published a lengthy, deeply researched feature that broke from the pack. This piece didn't lead with his title, it led with his strategy. It dissected one of his firm's successful turnarounds, detailing the operational efficiencies he had implemented and the market logic behind his investments. The tone was analytical, not accusatory. For the first time, the conversation in the serious press shifted from why he had left to how he was performing. This marked a critical legitimization, signaling to other business outlets that there was a substantive story here beyond the palace gates. This shift was accelerated by his own strategic approach to public relations. He and his team made a conscious decision to starve the beast of trivial gossip. They stopped engaging with, or even acknowledging, the tabloid speculation. Instead, they carefully managed his media accessibility, granting exclusive interviews only to serious business journalists who agreed to focus squarely on his work. He began appearing on sober financial podcasts and at high-level industry conferences, platforms where the discussion was inherently about markets and mergers, not monarchy. In these settings, he demonstrated a commanding grasp of his subject, speaking with an authority that finally began to eclipse his ancestry. The visuals changed, too. Paparazzi shots of him looking awkward in a new suit were replaced with professional headshots from his firm's website and press images of him speaking confidently at a podium with a company logo behind him. He was visually rebranding himself from a royal refugee into a corporate executive. His rare interviews on the subject of his transition became master classes in image management. When asked about the press, he avoided any trace of bitterness or victimhood. He might acknowledge the early coverage with a wry, slightly amused detachment, saying something like, "It was a lively period, but we were always focused on the work." He never took the bait to criticize specific reporters or outlets. Instead, he would reframe the entire experience as a challenging but ultimately useful lesson in focus and resilience. He might even express a degree of understanding, noting that his choice was unconventional and therefore inherently newsworthy. This graceful, non-combative stance disarmed his critics and made him appear more mature and focused than the publications that had once mocked him. He spoke of his public image not as a burden, but as another corporate asset to be managed, one that required careful strategy and a long-term view. The final phase of this media evolution saw him recast not as a novelty, but as a unique expert commentator. News channels covering a G20 summit or a global economic crisis began to book him not for his royal connections, but for his unique perspective at the intersection of geopolitics and business. A segment might feature a former ambassador, an economics professor, and him, the CEO with an insider's understanding of how political stability in a region impacts foreign direct investment. In this role, his background was not erased. It was finally contextualized as a form of elite expertise. His royal upbringing was no longer the story itself, but the foundation for a sophisticated analysis that few other commentators could provide. The media, in the end, didn't abandon its fascination with him. It simply matured in its understanding of what made him fascinating. The prince who chose corporate life had successfully negotiated a new treaty with the Fourth Estate, one where he was covered for what he did, not just for who he was. His long-term impact on the corporate world is a complex tapestry, woven from both tangible business achievements and a more profound, symbolic influence on the culture of leadership itself. While he never became a household name on the scale of a Rockefeller or a Gates, his legacy within the specific industries he inhabited is that of a respected and highly effective operator who brought a uniquely long-term, diplomatic perspective to the often myopic world of high finance. The most direct measure of his impact lies in the health and longevity of the companies his firm invested in and transformed. Unlike the slash and burn private equity model focused on quick flips, his strategy was characterized by a patient, almost stewardship-like approach to ownership. He favored investing in solid but struggling legacy businesses, manufacturers, industrial suppliers, logistics firms, and then applying a combination of capital and strategic oversight to modernize them. His true innovation wasn't a new financial instrument, but an operational philosophy that leveraged his innate understanding of stability and legacy. He wasn't just looking for a return. He was looking to build institutions that would endure, applying a monarchical sense of dynasty to his corporate portfolio. This approach saved numerous companies from bankruptcy, preserving thousands of jobs and revitalizing industrial sectors that many investors had written off as obsolete. The employees of these firms, who knew nothing of his background beyond a curious company memo, would remember him simply as the investor who believed in them when no one else would, and provided the resources for a comeback. Beyond the balance sheets, his most enduring contribution was the introduction of a different kind of corporate diplomacy. He operated with a discretion and a focus on long-term relationship building that was atypical in an industry known for its brashness and short-term thinking. He championed a style of negotiation that sought not to crush the opposition, but to find a sustainable equilibrium, understanding that a deal that left one party feeling exploited would ultimately fail. This wasn't weakness. It was a sophisticated strategy rooted in centuries of statecraft. He showed that you could be fiercely competitive while still maintaining a reputation for integrity and fairness. In an era of increasing scrutiny on corporate ethics, his firm's brand became synonymous with a quieter, more respectable form of capitalism. This influence subtly raised the bar for professional conduct within his niche, pressuring rivals to be more thoughtful about their own legacy and the social impact of their deals. Young associates who trained under him carried this philosophy into their own careers, creating a ripple effect of a more considered, long-view approach to business that extended far beyond his direct reach. So is he remembered as a transformative figure or a footnote? The answer lies somewhere in between, but leans decisively toward the former. He is not a footnote because his story is too unique and his successful navigation of two worlds too unprecedented to be forgotten. He is a permanent case study in business schools on the transferability of leadership skills and the strategic use of unconventional advantages. However, he was not transformative in the sense of inventing a new technology or creating a new market. His transformation was cultural and personal. He transformed the very idea of what a person in his position could do with their life, proving that the skills of a prince's strategic vision, immense emotional resilience, and the ability to navigate impossible complexity were not just relevant in the modern world, but could be a devastating competitive advantage. His legacy is not a specific company or product, but a powerful precedent. He is remembered as the man who had everything given to him and chose to earn it all over again, on his own terms, in an arena where his birthright was a curiosity, but his results were the only currency that truly mattered. He demonstrated that true power isn't just about the title you inherit, but the value you create. The most revealing insights into the prince's monumental decision come not from biographers or business analysts, but from the man himself. In rare interviews and carefully crafted passages of his authorized memoir, he offered a window into his internal world, revealing a complex mix of conviction, nostalgia, and resolute certainty that he had chosen the right path. He never framed his departure as a rejection of his family or his nation, but consistently as a pursuit of a different kind of service, one defined by creation rather than preservation. In one particularly poignant speech at a Business Leadership Awards ceremony, he reflected, "Duty is not a cage, it is a compass. For some, it points toward tradition and ceremony. For me, it pointed toward the marketplace, toward the messy, exhilarating work of building things that employ people, that solve problems, that contribute to progress in a tangible way. I simply followed my own North Star. This framing was a masterstroke, transforming a narrative of rebellion into one of purpose, suggesting that his corporate career was not an abandonment of duty, but a redefinition of it according to his own conscience." His reflections on happiness and fulfillment were strikingly pragmatic and devoid of any romanticism. He spoke not of chasing a vague feeling of joy, but of earning a profound sense of accomplishment. "Happiness is a fleeting emotion," he once told a journalist. "Fulfillment is something you build brick by brick, with your own hands and your own mind. In my previous life, my value was inherent. It was a fixed point on a map. In this life, my value is created anew every quarter. There is a deep and abiding satisfaction in that struggle, in the sheer effort of it." He described the intense gratification of seeing a company he helped turn around not just survive, but thrive, knowing that his strategic decisions had a direct impact on the livelihoods of hundreds of employees and their families. This, to him, was a more immediate and measurable form of service than his ceremonial role had ever offered. He contrasted the passive admiration he received as a prince with the earned respect of his colleagues, noting that the latter, though harder one, felt infinitely more authentic and meaningful. When pressed on the subject of regret, his answers were nuanced but unequivocal. He expressed a deep and abiding sadness for the personal rifts and the strain his choice had placed on his family, acknowledging the pain and confusion he had caused his parents. "I regret the hurt," he would say, "but I cannot regret the choice itself. To have stayed would have been a far greater betrayal, a betrayal of my own potential." He admitted to missing the camaraderie of the royal household, the shared sense of history, and the connection to his nation in that particular ceremonial way. He missed the pageantry on occasion, the unifying power of a major state event, but he was adamant that he did not miss the constraints, the lack of autonomy, or the feeling of being a custodian rather than a creator. "Nostalgia is a powerful force," he wrote, "but it should not be mistaken for a guiding principle. You can miss a chapter of your life without ever wishing to rewrite it." Perhaps his most profound insight was into the nature of identity itself. He described the transition not as swapping one identity for another, but as a process of integration. I am not a businessman who used to be a prince, nor a prince who dabbles in business, he explained. I am a man who carries both experiences within him. The discipline I learned in the palace informs my leadership in the boardroom. The global perspective I gained from my upbringing allows me to see market trends others might miss. And the humility I've learned from starting at the bottom in a new field has, I hope, made me a more empathetic and effective leader. These are not separate lives. They are layers of a single life. This reconciliation allowed him to finally silence the internal chorus of imposter syndrome, understanding that his unique background was not a handicap to be overcome, but a unique lens through which to view the world, a combination of skills that no one else could possibly replicate. His reflections reveal a man who, after years of struggle, found not just success, but a hard-won and deeply personal peace, having finally forged an identity that was entirely and authentically his own. So where does this remarkable journey leave us? The story of this prince is far more than a royal scandal or a simple tale of rebellion. It stands as a powerful, modern parable about the very nature of identity and the eternal tension between the legacy we inherit and the life we choose to build for ourselves. His path represents a bold and unprecedented fusion, a merging of aristocratic tradition with raw entrepreneurial ambition. He didn't just leave one world for another. He took the tools from his gilded upbringing, the discipline, the global perspective, the unflappable grace under pressure, and repurposed them as devastating advantages in the competitive arena of high finance. In doing so, he challenged the deepest assumptions of both worlds, proving to the aristocracy that meritocracy isn't a threat, but a complement to tradition, and showing the corporate sphere that the soft skills of diplomacy and long-term thinking hold immense commercial value. His life forces us to confront a fundamental question that resonates far beyond palace walls. In a world that often demands we choose between tradition and modernity, must we really pick a side? Or is there a way to honor the past while still forging a future that is authentically our own? The prince's answer was a resounding yes to the latter. He demonstrated that our origins, no matter how privileged or constrained, don't have to be a prison. They can be a foundation, a set of unique experiences that we can choose to build upon, adapt, or even defy in the pursuit of a more meaningful existence. His struggle was the ultimate act of self-determination, a declaration that even a destiny written in the stars can be edited by the hand that holds the pen. And now we turn the question over to you. His story is a mirror reflecting our own choices about duty, passion, and personal freedom. We want to hear your verdict. Given the extraordinary chance, which path would you choose? Would you embrace the crown, accepting a life of immense privilege, profound duty, and historic purpose, knowing it comes with unimaginable scrutiny and the sacrifice of personal ambition? Or would you, like our prince, choose the corporation, opting for the thrill of the deal, the autonomy of building your own fortune, and the satisfaction of earning your own way, even if it means walking away from a predetermined legacy and facing the judgment of both your family and the world? There are no right or wrong answers, only fascinating perspectives. Let us know in the comments below. Would you take the crown or choose the corporation? Share your thoughts and join the conversation.